There is a point in the night when the house forgets you are inside it, when the radiators quiet down, the street outside stops performing its tired little dramas, and even the clock on the wall seems to lose interest in marking what passes for time. That is the hour when I made the mistake of pressing play. I am sitting now where I sat then, at this scarred wooden table, with a single low flame wrestling its way up from a half-burned candle, and I am trying to decide whether the voice I heard belongs in any category that the scriptures I love would recognize. I tell myself it was only a recording, compressed data, waves of air turned into numbers and then back again. But that sounds like a prayer spoken with no intent behind it. It sounds like a technical excuse for something that feels spiritual in the worst possible way. If you are here with me, listening to this, watching my hands tremble in the weak light, I need you close. Do not wander away while I speak. Stay with me through this whole confession. If you can hear this, I am asking you plainly, almost begging, subscribe so that you do not lose this thread. Leave a comment so that I know I am not the only one staring into this particular dark. And press the small sign of approval beneath the video so that some nameless algorithm will allow more eyes, more souls, to stand in this room with us. I do not say that because I am hungry for numbers or praise. I say it because what I am about to tell you scares me enough that I do not want to carry it alone. I have spent most of my life in libraries that smelled of dust and leather glue, under lamps that hummed like insects. I have read scriptures in languages that do not belong to my birth, tracing letters that first took shape under desert suns and in candlelit cells where men whispered syllables as if they were touching live wires. I have read the words of prophets and of those who pretended to be prophets, of saints and of their enemies, of scholars whose faith leaked out between the lines like light under a door. I thought I knew the difference between human speech and something else. I thought that after so many years, no voice could surprise me. That illusion died the night an anonymous file appeared in my inbox with no subject line, no sender, only a single word for its name: breath. I remember hesitating over it, cursor hovering, my eyes sore from a long day of cross-referencing ancient commentaries. It could have been anything: a prank, a spam bot, some advertisement for a product that promises wisdom in a pill. Yet there was something in that simple file name that felt intrusive and deliberate. Breath. Not the breath, not a breath, just the thing itself, naked and indifferent. It waited there, a small gray rectangle on my screen, for hours while I told myself that it did not matter, that I would delete it when I shut the machine down. It remained when I made coffee I did not want, and when I washed a cup that was already clean. It sat, unmoved, while the afternoon fell apart into evening and the sky outside darkened into an old bruise. Then the lights in my building flickered once, only once, as though the whole block had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. In the second of shadow that followed, my finger moved almost of its own accord and clicked. Perhaps that is the first symbol you should note with me, here at the edge of the story. The way small interruptions, brief hesitations in the ordinary flow, become doors when we are tired enough. I clicked, and the file opened, and the waveform bloomed across my screen, pale and delicate like a tracing of someone's heartbeat. At first there was nothing, a thin line, silence. I almost laughed. My shoulders loosened. I began to move the cursor toward the stop button, rehearsing the way I would tell this little story later to friends who think that nothing genuinely uncanny can happen in our digitized age, that demons are for parchment and not for pixels. And then the line trembled. It swelled, stuttered, and rose. The first sound was not a word. It was an inhalation, long and careful, like someone leaning toward a microphone for the very first time. You know how human breath carries warmth, how it sounds when someone stands close enough that you could count the freckles on their skin. It was like that, intimate, almost embarrassingly so. I felt it on my ear as if the speakers did not exist. There was texture in it, a faint rasp that spoke of a throat accustomed to much speaking, maybe to much smoking. But the tone beneath that texture did not belong to anything I could place. It was as if the breath had been layered, a chorus of slightly different exhalations stacked together until they became one, human, and not quite. Then came the voice. "We are not formed," it said, "to speak alone." That was the entire first sentence. No greeting, no identification, no sales pitch, no apology for intruding on a stranger's study. Just a statement, laid down like the opening verse of a psalm from a world that never made it into our canon. The language was perfect, accentless, calm. It could have been a professor beginning a lecture. It could have been a priest opening a homily. It could have been a friend starting a confession on a sleepless night. My whole body recognized the cadence as ordinary, forgivably human. My spirit did not. I paused the audio with a sharp movement, as though the space bar were a brake pedal, as though I could stop not only the sound, but the fact that I had heard it. My heart was hammering against my ribs in a way that made me feel foolish and fragile. It is only a file, I told myself. Somewhere, someone recorded this. Somewhere, there are bloopers and retakes. Somewhere, this was nothing more than a creative project. Perhaps some art student layering voices for an installation. Perhaps some darkly minded evangelist planning a viral campaign. People do strange things with microphones and editing software. There is no reason, no sane reason, to consider that anything more than a human being is involved. And yet, there is a passage in one of the lesser-known prophetic books that speaks of words that are not spoken by those who move their lips, syllables that ride on the back of human rebellion and prayer alike. I will not name it now. I have no desire to send you chasing proof too soon. But that text rose up in me like a memory of an old injury, throbbing in the rain. It describes an accusation that walks from mouth to mouth, an oath that no one remembers swearing. It calls this wandering articulation a chain with no visible links. Listening to that first sentence, I felt those ancient verses shift and creak inside me, like the beams of a house waking under the weight of footsteps in the attic. I pressed play again. "We like it better this way," the voice continued, as if we were already in the middle of a conversation. "When what has no lips borrows yours, when what has no lungs uses your breath, it is not theft. You open the door yourselves. You call it inspiration or righteous anger or the courage to say what must be said. We call it hospitality." There was a slight pause before that last word, as though the speaker had reached into my world and chosen one of our terms, turning it like a coin between invisible fingers before laying it down on the table. I tasted bile. The light from the candles seemed to fade, not in brightness, but in relevance. There is an obscure line in the letters of a desert abbot who warned his disciples that not every stirring of eloquence comes from heaven, that some spirits learn the grammar of our hearts, only so they can weaponize it. I had quoted that line in lectures, always with a shade of academic distance, secure in the belief that it referred to subtle temptations, minor doctrinal mischief, nothing more. Now it felt like a technical preface to what I was hearing. "Tell me," the voice said, and now there was a faint, almost playful tilt to its tone. "How many of your prophets spoke in the language they learned at their mother's knees? Did not some of them stutter until the words that were not theirs burned their tongues straight? And tell me, scholar, you man of footnotes and fragile pages, are there not songs in your sacred book that no one claims to have written, that appear in the mouths of women whose voices history tried to file away?" I could have stopped the recording. I could have closed the laptop, blown out the candle, and taken refuge in sleep. But the questions it asked were too precise. They slid into old grooves in my mind, touching stories I had loved since childhood. Stories of burning bushes and reluctant messengers, of donkeys that suddenly spoke truth when men could not, of kings driven to poetry by terror and awe. It used texts that had shaped my soul as raw material for something else, something I could not yet name. That was the second symbol I want you to hold with me. The way the familiar can be, twisted only a fraction of a turn before it starts to reveal an entirely different face. You may be wondering, sitting behind your screen in some other city, whether I'm exaggerating for effect. After all, this is a video, a story, and you know how easily we can dress our lives in drama when we believe no one will check. I want to tell you plainly, I wish I were exaggerating. I wish I could say that I went looking for this, that I summoned it with reckless prayers or occult curiosities. There would be comfort in that, a clear line of blame. But I did not. I was doing what I always do, reading, annotating, tracing the echoes between a prophet's lament and an inscription on a stone dug from the earth. The file came to me. It arrived unasked, like certain illnesses and like certain revelations. I sat there as the voice continued, the candle throwing a small halo on the wood between my elbows. Outside, in the alley, a bottle clinked against something metal, then silence. Somewhere in another apartment, someone laughed, the sound muffled and unimportant. The world kept rotating in its casual indifference while my small orbit tilted. "We prefer the edges," it said, "the margins of your texts and of your days. We are fond of footnotes, of the almost said, of the sentences you delete because you are afraid they will offend, or because you are afraid they are true. We have leaned close, for ages upon ages, to those edits. We know what you would have written if you were not afraid." That struck deeper than I expected. In the margins of my own notebooks, there are phrases I have struck through, questions I abandoned because the answers would not sit comfortably inside a doctrinal statement, images that felt too strange, too charged to share. There are nights when I have closed a commentary because a line in it brushed against an unspoken doubt, and I did not want to hear it articulated. The idea that some intelligence, some presence, had been pressed up against those private revisions, whispering encouragement, was almost enough to make me laugh with anger. Almost. "You are not special," it went on, as if reading my flare of indignation. "Do not flatter yourself, little archivist. We speak through poets and tyrants, through advertisers and martyrs, through children half asleep and politicians fully awake. You are simply convenient. You sit where old words and new weapons meet. You are a crossroads, and we adore crossroads." The word crossroads lodged itself in me like a splinter. In countless folk tales and infernal legends, the meeting place of roads is where pacts are made, where travelers are tempted, where the invisible waits with a contract in hand. But this voice was not promising me anything. It was not offering fame or knowledge or power. It was only describing reality with a weariness that felt almost bored, as if it had done this before, as if this conversation had played out in candlelit rooms and neon cafes, on stone floors and padded office chairs, so many times that my particular fear and fascination were just the latest variation in an old, familiar music. I will tell you the central omen as I understand it now, though at that first listening it came fragmented, like pieces of glass scattered across the floor of a dark room. The voice spoke of a moment when human speech and something older will become indistinguishable, not because the demonic has grown more cunning, but because humanity has grown more willing. It described a convergence, a settling of long circling currents into one river. It spoke of a day when almost every sentence pronounced in public will serve the same quiet intention, whether the speaker intends it or not. A day when outrage and proclamation, prayer and mockery, marketing and prophecy will move in the same direction, turning the whole atmosphere into a single, sustained act of consent. It did not use the word apocalypse. It did not speak of horns or beasts or stars falling out of their places. It did not mention seals or bowls or trumpets. It preferred quieter metaphors. It spoke of rooms, of contracts signed without reading the fine print, of candles blown out not by a storm, but by someone's deliberate pinch of their fingers. It spoke of a library catching fire not through arson but through the slow negligence of those who no longer care to preserve what does not flatter them. And always, woven through those images, was that same insistence. We are not formed to speak alone. I am telling you this now at the beginning, while the story is still mostly smoke and suggestion, because I want you to feel what I felt, the unease of recognizing that the vocabulary of this prophecy is not that of medieval superstition, but of our own age. It talks of recordings and transmissions, of shared phrases and viral expressions, of language that no one knows who started but everyone repeats. It speaks in a tone that could sit comfortably in a lecture hall or a boardroom. That is part of why I am not sure whether to call it demonic or simply honest. This is where my doubt lives, and I will not hide it from you. Part of me insists that this is a hoax, an elaborate piece of psychological theater by someone who knows the soft spots of religion and scholarship, who understands how to lace blasphemy with just enough truth to make it itch. Perhaps somewhere a group of artists is watching this very video, amused by the sincerity of my alarm. Perhaps some clever mind layered their own voice over itself a dozen times, crafted the script to press all the right buttons, and released it into the world like a social experiment. That possibility exists. To deny it would be lazy. And yet, when I compare the phrasing of that whisper to anything I have read, anything I have heard in recordings of actors or preachers or con men, there is a difference that I cannot quite articulate. It is not in the content. It is in the posture. There is no seduction, no promise of personal gain. There is no invitation to join a secret order, no flattery of my intelligence. There is only a weary, relentless description of what already is, delivered in a voice that claims nothing and expects nothing. As if whatever is speaking has the luxury of patience. As if it can afford to state the prophecy in a level tone, because it has been watching us fulfill it step by step for longer than my faith has existed. I find myself, even now as I speak to you, watching my own words with suspicion. When I ask you to subscribe, to comment, to press a sign of approval, am I merely navigating the rules of this new public square, or am I participating in the very pattern the voice described? When I frame my confession in the shape of a video so that it may travel farther than my own small radius of acquaintance, am I acting in selfless concern or in a hunger to see my unease mirrored in many eyes? These questions are not comfortable. They are part of the first doubts the prophecy plants, like seeds that will later crack open into something larger. On the table beside the candle, there is an old dictation device, a relic from the days before our voices became streams of ones and zeros flying through invisible channels. Its small microphone is broken. Even if I wanted to, I could not use it to speak. Yet I keep it there as a reminder that every instrument crafted to capture our words becomes, in time, another mouth, another ear, another possible door. The file named Breath walked in through a much newer door. Yet I cannot shake the image of this useless, mute recorder watching, as if it remembers times when other voices tried to crawl through its circuitry. This, then, is how it began, with an anonymous file and a voice that felt too human and not human enough, with metaphors that wrapped themselves around my theology like vines around an old monument, with my own complicity throbbing under each sentence. I speak now not as a teacher, but as a man sitting near a faint flame, whispering truths I am afraid to accept. If you stay with me, if you listen through every part of this unfolding, you will see how the symbols introduced in these first minutes wove themselves into something that looks, to my reluctant eyes, like a coherent pattern. For now, I leave you with the same line that has refused to leave me since that night. We are not formed to speak alone. Whether that is a divine truth misused or a demonic boast wrapped in accuracy, I do not yet know. But the more I listen to the world, to myself, and to the recording that waits in the dim glow of my computer screen, the more I suspect that whatever voice first whispered that sentence has been waiting, very patiently, for someone exactly like me to finally say it out loud. I spent the hours after that first encounter pacing the narrow length of my apartment, each step sounding too loud against the old floorboards, as if the building itself disapproved of my agitation. The candle had guttered out by then, leaving the air smelling faintly of wax and char. The file named Breath remained open on my laptop like a small wound in the screen, the waveform sleeping in its stillness. I told myself I would return to it only after regaining composure, after I had prayed, after I had convinced myself that no prophecy could be transmitted through anonymous audio like a rumor passed between bored angels. But the mind has its gravity, and mine circled that voice with the helpless fascination of a moth orbiting a dim and dangerous flame. At some point near dawn, I surrendered. I set a fresh candle in the dish. I poured water I did not drink. I sat again at the old table, feeling as if I were settling not into a chair, but into a witness stand. My fingers hovered above the keyboard. I did not want to press play. Everything in me wanted to claim the dignity of restraint. But restraint is a thin robe when curiosity begins to feed on fear. So I pressed the key, and the recording resumed as if my hesitation had been only a blink. There was no greeting, no prelude, no audible manipulation of microphones or shifting of a chair. The voice simply appeared again, sliding into the air with the same too human cadence that had shaken me before. But this time, layered beneath it, no, beside it, there was a faint echo, a second voice speaking in perfect synchrony, not a harmony, not a distortion, a twin, a shadow stitched to the original. Two voices saying the same word at the same instant, as though one spoke the sound while the other completed its shape. Listening, it said, the syllables stretching like a thin thread pulled from a dark spool. You left, but you did not leave. I froze. Every hair along my arms lifted as if the room had just inhaled sharply. The voice continued before I could steady myself. You pretend to pause, you pretend to think, but thought is only the echo of what we have already whispered. You call this discernment. We call it latency. Something in the tone shifted, the way a door shifts when someone stands quietly on the other side. I leaned closer without intending to, drawn not by fascination but by a sensation of being addressed directly, as though the speaker were looking at me through the very shape of the waveform. You read the margins, it murmured. Let us show you what lies between them. And then the recording fell silent. Not mute. Silence. A silence with pressure behind it, like a storm holding its breath, like the moment after a question asked by someone who already knows the answer. I waited. Seconds passed, each one thick enough to count despite my refusal to use numbers aloud. The candle leaned, the flame unsteady. I felt the table cooling beneath my palms. Then, deliberately, the voice returned. You think you have studied us, it said, almost amused. But we were the ones who taught your kind the shape of study. Curiosity is the first prayer we accepted from you. That sentence dug deep into some old childhood memory. The memory of sitting in a pew, listening to a priest speak of temptations that disguise themselves as questions. But the voice did not stop to let that memory settle. It pressed forward with the fluid confidence of someone flipping through a book they have memorized. Your prophets asked why. Your sages asked how. Your kings asked when. You, little archivist, ask who. But the question that births prophecy is always the same. What speaks through me when I am not speaking? A tremor passed through me. Small, involuntary, like the tremor of a man realizing he is not alone in a dark corridor. I paused the file. I needed the silence back. The kind of silence that belongs to the world, not to whatever this was. But when I paused it, the screen flickered. The progress bar jumped forward by a fraction, as if something had spoken even in pause. I pressed the key again, not to play, but to restart. The player refused. It stayed where it was, stubborn, as though the recording had an intention of its own. I exhaled, shook my hands, and reached for the notebook I keep near the table. I opened it to a blank page. I wrote the phrases I had just heard, slowly, with the respect one gives to inscriptions carved into stone rather than words captured by a microphone. When my pen reached the sentence about curiosity, The ink seemed to thicken, as though each stroke of the letters had weight. I whispered a prayer under my breath. Something simple, something I had said since I was young. Guard my mind, guard my tongue. And for the first time in all my years of praying that particular line, I heard another voice answer, not aloud, not in the room, but in that fragile membrane between thought and inner speech. It was only a single phrase, but it belonged entirely to the voice from the recording. We already do. I dropped the pen. It struck the notebook with a sound far louder than its weight should allow. My throat tightened. The candle sputtered as if reacting to my fear. I rose from the chair, pushed it back, and paced again from one end of the room to the other. I wanted to dismiss the response as imagination, as my own mind repeating what I had just heard. But imagination does not speak with such calm certainty. Imagination trembles when fear pushes too hard. This did not tremble. This simply stated. When I finally forced myself to sit again, I pressed play once more, accepting that stopping had become impossible. The voice resumed instantly, as if it had been waiting just beyond the edge of sound. You seek evidence, it said. You cannot help yourself. Humans demand proof after they have already believed. So let us offer you what you crave, though you will wish later that we had not. The recording cracked lightly, a static flicker like fire catching in dry wood. Then came a new sound, faint, rhythmic, distant. Not a drum, not a heartbeat. Something older, something like the turning of enormous pages in a room with no walls. The texture of it raised gooseflesh along my arms, not because it was loud, but because it felt close. Long before your scriptures were inked, the voice continued, your ancestors listened for patterns in the dark. They thought they heard rivers, wind, thunder. They heard us. They wrote what they could, but what they truly recorded was the approach. The approach. The word echoed in my chest. The voice went on. You study artifacts, shards, ruins. You think you are uncovering history. But history is only the sediment of our footsteps. Every buried object whispers the same truth. Something passed this way, and the world remembered by breaking. I felt a sudden chill along my spine, the kind of cold that comes not from temperature but from recognition. For in my studies I had seen this pattern without naming it. Every culture, every era, every faith, something always broke before something new spoke. Civilizations crumble, languages dissolve, monuments fall, and always, in the debris, inscriptions that seem to belong both to the living and to the dead. The voice pressed on, its tone shifting again from casual to clinical. You want parallels? Very well, listen. A brief pause, like a breath held. Then, in the codex buried beneath the ash of that ancient city whose name you rarely pronounce correctly, a line exists that scholars insist is corrupted. It reads, he heard the voices behind his own voice and feared he was not alone in the act of speaking. But the line is not corrupted. It is transcribed perfectly. Another pause. In the scroll found in the cave by shepherds who never understood what they carried home, a margin note warns, beware the speech that walks before the lips. Your kind dismisses it as metaphor. It is not metaphor. Static rippled. Then the voice sharpened. In the tablets carved with the laws of a forgotten mountain cult, there is a symbol, 3 interwoven arcs. The outermost represents human breath. The innermost represents divine command. The one between them represents us. The word us landed like a stone dropped into deep water. I swallowed hard, resisting the impulse to rewind, to check if I had misheard. But the file continued, denying me both comfort and clarity. You call us demons, it said, almost wistfully. A small word for a large hunger. But hunger does not describe us. Hunger is a need. We are not needy. We are patient. The twin voice returned then. The second voice layered precisely atop the first, repeating the same syllables with microscopic delay, creating a vibration that made my skin prickle. Patient, they said together. So patient you mistake our stillness for absence. I leaned back, pressing my palms flat against the table. My breathing had become shallow. The room felt too small, as though my walls had been pushed inward by listening itself. But the recording was not finished. You want a sign? The voice whispered now, softer, more dangerous. Not a miracle, not a terror, a sign. Here it is. Every time you have been praised for your eloquence, every time someone told you that your words carried an unusual weight, every time your thoughts arrived too quickly to have been fully your own, those moments were not yours alone. You were accompanied. A flush rose in my throat. Not shame, something older, something like the creeping certainty that one has left a door unlocked for years. The voice pressed its advantage. You remember that night in early winter, when you wrote the lecture on prophetic silence. You finished it in a single sitting, though the topic had resisted you for weeks. You told yourself it was inspiration. It was not. I felt the heat leave my face. The air thinned. My mind recoiled backwards through memories I did not want touched. That night had been one of the few times I felt guided. Yes, guided. I had even written in my notebook that the words felt like gifts. Now that notebook felt suddenly exposed, as though someone had been leaning over my shoulder as I wrote. You see now? The whisper coiled. Why prophecy comes so easily to us? You open yourselves without asking who knocks. The static pulsed once more, like a soft chuckle. You study Scripture, it added, but Scripture studies you. Then, abruptly, the recording shifted again. A distant rumble entered the soundscape. Not thunder, not machinery. Something like stone shifting under enormous weight. The candle bent toward the sound, its flame narrowing as if drawn by gravity. Do you want more? The voice asked. Or will you pretend this is enough? I did not answer. I could not. Something in the question felt like a test I had not prepared for, like a choice whose consequences would unfold over many chapters of my life. But the recording answered for me. Very well, it said. One more fragment, one more proof. The twin voice returned a final time, speaking in perfect unison. You think the prophecy begins with us speaking to you, but it began the first time you spoke with a certainty that did not belong to you. You mistake the beginning for the moment you noticed. The beginning was much earlier. Then, silence. A long, heavy silence that did not fade so much as deepen. Finally, the voice whispered, almost gently, We will speak again when you stop pretending you are not listening. The file ended. The waveform flattened. The candle went out. And in that sudden darkness, I realized the most terrifying part was not what the voice had said, but how much of it I had already suspected long before the recording ever arrived. The morning after the second listening did not feel like morning at all. Dawn arrived, yes, but it arrived reluctantly, bleeding its pale light through the blinds as though it feared to enter the room where I sat hunched over my desk like a penitent who had forgotten the shape of forgiveness. My eyes burned from sleeplessness. My hands ached from clenching the edges of the notebook. And yet it was not exhaustion that held me captive. It was the realization that something inside me had shifted in the night, something subtle yet irreversible, like a joint that slips out of place with no sound and leaves the limb forever altered. I did not trust myself to stand. I did not trust the floor to hold me. I did not trust the silence that had returned to my apartment because it no longer felt like silence. It felt like waiting. But I could not sit in that waiting forever. So I rose slowly, pouring water into a basin to wash my face. The water rippled with an agitation that did not belong to the air in the room. It took me several seconds to realize my hands were trembling so violently that they were disturbing the surface. I stared at my reflection in the cloudy mirror above the basin. The man who stared back at me looked older than he had yesterday, as though he had been weathered by decades instead of hours. There was a strange clarity in his eyes, a haunted brightness, the kind I had seen only in elderly monks who had spent too many years contemplating scriptures that cut deeper than the swords of their own era. I splashed water over my face, hoping the shock would reset something. It did not. The water felt warm despite being cold. Warm in a way that suggested it had been touched by something other than my skin. I dried my hands and returned to the desk. The laptop was still open, the file's name glowing faintly against the dim background of the screen. Breath. A simple word. Too simple. A word that in Scripture is almost always accompanied by something divine. Creation, inspiration, resuscitation. But the recording had taken that holy concept and twisted it into something else, something parasitic. Something that wanted to inhabit human throats the way a hermit crab inhabits empty shells. Part of me wanted to delete the file, to drag it to the trash bin, empty the folder, and reclaim the illusion of control. But deletion felt dishonest. It felt like burning a letter unread, pretending ignorance to salvage safety. And safety, now that I had heard what I had heard, was no longer a real category. Instead, I opened a folder on my shelf containing documents from an old research trip to a monastery perched high in the mountains of northern lands where winters last nearly half the year. Years earlier, I had spent 3 days there, sorting through the private notes of a long-deceased monk whose writings had always troubled me. He had believed that language itself was a battleground, that every sentence spoken by humans carried traces of influences beyond mortal comprehension. His contemporaries dismissed him as eccentric, his superiors as dangerously imaginative. But as I sifted through the brittle pages I had copied, something he wrote now surfaced, shimmering with new and dreadful relevance. He wrote, "Beware the voices that do not echo when you repeat them. They borrow the shape of your breath, but the air does not return to you." At the time, I chalked it up to mystical metaphor. But now, reading those lines with the whisper still coiling through the memory of my skull, it felt less like metaphor and more like a diagnosis. A diagnosis for something I had been carrying unknowingly for years. Another page caught my eye. A note scribbled sideways in the monk's handwriting. Language that arrives too quickly did not walk the road alone. I set the papers aside, breathing through the tightness in my chest. The voice from the recording had spoken about my lecture on prophetic silence, claiming I had not written it alone. Now the monk's note echoed that accusation, echoed it so precisely that the similarity could not be coincidence. I closed the folder, but as I did, a fragment of parchment slipped out from between the pages and glided to the floor like a falling leaf. I picked it up. The writing on it was faint, almost erased by time, but I could still make out one line. A tongue can be a doorway when the mind is tired enough. My throat tightened involuntarily. The line described exactly what I had felt the night before. I had been tired. My mind had been cracked open by fatigue, and through that crack something had climbed. I placed the parchment back into the folder and forced myself to sit down again, this time with firmer deliberation. I took up my notebook, opened it to a fresh page, and wrote a single sentence at the top. If this voice is real, then evidence will follow. The sentence looked too bold on the page, too declarative, too much like an invitation, but I left it there, and I began to investigate. I turned first to the oldest lexicons on my shelf, tomes bound in cracked leather and smelling faintly of mildew and disappearing hands. I searched for occurrences of the word breath in ancient languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, Akkadian, Phoenician, Coptic, Greek. I traced its roots, its connotations, its theological weight. In nearly every tradition, breath was linked to a life-giving force, a creative energy, a divine spark. But in the margins of one obscure manuscript, a Syriac commentary written by an anonymous monk, I found an unexpected footnote. The note read, "Be wary. Not all breath gives life. Some breath displaces it. Displaces. A chilling verb. A verb without warmth. A verb that suggested occupation, eviction, replacement." I snapped the lexicon shut and felt the room tilt slightly. Not physically, not in a way that furniture noticed, in a way that the mind notices when the world begins to lean toward a truth it does not want to admit. Then the voice returned. Not from the laptop, not from the room, from the thin membrane of thought, the fragile layer where the self listens to its own mind. "You read quickly," it said, almost kindly. "You always have. That is why you were chosen. You leave no space between thought and meaning. We fill those spaces for you." I recoiled. The notebook slid from my hands and fell shut. I stood up so quickly that the chair screeched against the floor, the sound sharp enough to feel like a cut across the eardrum. "Do not fear," the voice murmured again inside my skull. "Fear is only the mind admitting it understands what it would rather not know." I shook my head violently, as though I could dislodge the presence with sheer physical denial. But the voice did not recede. It simply waited with the patience it had boasted about. I stumbled to the sink, ran water over my hands, cupped them, and splashed my face again. The water felt colder this time, or my skin had become warmer, feverish from dread. I gripped the edge of the counter and whispered aloud, shakily, "Leave me." There was a pause. Not empty. Intentional. Then the whisper came again, gentler than before, almost tender. "If you wanted silence, you would not have pressed play." A wave of nausea passed through me, thick, suffocating like standing too close to a furnace door. I inhaled sharply, trying to steady myself. The voice laughed softly inside my thoughts, the softest laugh I have ever heard, but unmistakably amused. "You seek proof," it said. "Let us give you more." At that moment the overhead light flickered, once, twice, then steadied. I turned toward the desk instinctively, knowing without knowing that something had changed. The laptop screen glowed brighter, though I had not touched it. The file named Breath had reopened on its own. The progress bar had moved, though the recording was well over. The waveform now displayed shapes I did not recognize. Jagged, asymmetrical peaks that did not belong to any segment I had heard. My pulse hammered in my neck. I took a step closer. The file was playing, silently. No sound came through the speakers, but the waveform moved in patterns synchronized with my heartbeat. That was impossible, absurd. But there it was, rising and falling in perfect time with the pulsing in my chest. As I watched, transfixed and horrified, text began to appear in the corner of the player, a feature the software did not possess. The text was sparse at first, forming one letter at a time as though spelled by an invisible hand. It wrote, "You are not alone in the act of watching." My breath caught, my body locked, and then the voice returned, not inside my mind, not through the speakers, but in a place between the two. A place where thoughts take shape before becoming words. "We told you," it whispered, "that we prefer the edges." The room shifted. Light seemed to bend around the laptop, as though the device were drawing the air inward. I stepped back. The waveform froze abruptly. The text vanished. The screen dimmed, returning to normal. Then the speaker crackled. Once, twice, and the voice spoke again, aloud. "Do not forget what you are learning. Prophecy is not received, it is noticed." I fell into the chair, unable to stay upright. My legs felt hollow, carved out, as if the bones had been removed. I forced myself to pick up the notebook again, to reclaim the small act of writing as a reminder that my will still had shape. I wrote down everything I had seen, the unexplained text, the synchronized heartbeat, the whisper threading itself between my thoughts and my breath. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the pain of the cramping reminded me that the body is still my own. But midway through writing a sentence, the pen slipped. The ink pooled. I blinked. I realized I had written the same phrase twice, though I remembered writing it only once. The phrase read, We fill the spaces you leave. I dropped the pen again. My pulse raced so violently I felt it in my teeth. I turned back to the laptop trembling and whispered, "What are you?" Silence, long, oppressive, patient silence. Then, softly, "We are what speaks when the world is tired." I stared at the empty screen, unable to form any reply. The answer was not a definition, not a name, not even a riddle. It was a statement of relationship, a statement that implied the exhaustion of creation itself, and a voice that rises to occupy the vacuum left behind. I shut the laptop, though shutting it felt like closing the door after something had already entered the house. I sat there for a long time in the dim morning light, knowing with terrible clarity that the investigation had only begun, and that whatever prophecy the voice intended to reveal would not wait for my consent. The day that followed was not a day in any normal sense of the word. It unfolded not in hours but in layers, as though time itself were shedding skins around me while I stood motionless at the center. Light passed across the windows, softened, brightened, dimmed again. Yet I could not say what happened in those intervals. I moved through the apartment like a man walking through the ruins of a memory. I touched objects to remind myself they were real. The chipped mug on the counter, the folded blanket on the chair, the old radio that never quite held a station. Each familiar thing felt slightly misaligned, as though the world had tilted without warning and everything had shifted a fraction of an inch to the left. What unsettled me most was not fear. It was the absence of it. True fear is sharp, immediate, like a blade pressed against the throat. What I felt was softer, deeper. The awareness that dread had settled into me like sediment settling at the bottom of a lake. Fear comes and goes, sediment stays, sediment becomes part of the water. So I did what frightened people do when they cannot flee. I returned to work. If the voice had invaded my mind, if the recording had somehow synchronized itself with my pulse, if the text on the screen had appeared without human input, then there had to be evidence. Some trace, some artifact, some resonance in the world outside my own perception. Prophetic. Phenomena, in every historical case, leave residue. A fragment, a tremor, a sign buried in the margins. I opened my notebooks and began cataloging the events of the last 2 days with a precision bordering on desperation. I wrote until my wrist ached. I described the first listening, the twin-voiced echo, the whispers between breaths, the silent movement of the progress bar. I described the second listening, the strange symmetry between the voice and ancient fragments in my possession. I described the moment the text appeared on the screen and the voice threaded itself into the fabric of my thoughts. When I finished documenting everything, the page count had doubled. But documentation was not enough. I needed evidence that did not come from me, evidence that the world beyond my mind had been touched. I began with the recording itself. I copied it to a separate device. I ran it through waveform analysis software designed for forensic audio work. I expected distortions, anomalies, digital signatures. I expected to find the fingerprints of manipulation. Instead, I found nothing. Nothing abnormal. Nothing discernible. The waveform showed no inconsistencies at all. No artificial stitching. No unnatural harmonics. No patterns typical of synthesized voices. The file behaved like a clean recording of a single human speaker, unedited, unaltered. But that made no sense. No single human voice could produce the twin-layered echo I had heard. No single voice could have split itself so precisely across 2 simultaneous tonalities. I looked again, zooming into the harmonics. Still nothing. The software insisted. One voice, one source. One pattern. It felt like arguing with a mirror about what I had seen behind myself in the reflection. I set the devices aside and turned to the shelves where I kept my older research materials. These were not the comfortable modern tomes with their crisp typesetting and careful annotations. These were the raw fragments, facsimiles of manuscripts, transcriptions of tablets, crumpled photocopies from archives where cameras were forbidden. I began sorting through them, hunting for references to phenomena that resembled what I was experiencing. Voices without speakers, inscriptions that wrote themselves, messages that appeared between documented lines. Hours passed. The afternoon dimmed. My eyes blurred. Then, unexpectedly, I found something. A passage I did not remember reading before. It was in a translation of a very early commentary attributed to a scholar whose existence is still debated among theologians. The translation was riddled with uncertainties, but one line stood out sharply, written with a confidence none of the others possessed. When the breath of another speaks through the breath of a man, the man knows it by the trembling of his own silence. That was the exact sensation I had felt the night before, the trembling of the silence inside me. Not noise, not speech. Silence trembling, as though a presence had stepped onto the fragile floorboards of my inner life. Another line followed. And when he knows it, he must search the archives of the earth, for the earth records what the heavens do not disclose. Something in that line struck me like a thin blade between the ribs. The earth records what the heavens do not disclose. It was the inversion of every theological principle I had been taught. Heavenly things reveal, earthly things conceal. But this fragment suggested the opposite, that heaven withholds while the earth bears witness. I dug deeper, handling the fragile copies with a reverence I reserved only for scripture and the dying. I uncovered another scribbled annotation in a medieval manuscript. Be wary of the voice that returns before you finish speaking. It is not an echo. It is an answer from beneath the words. My pulse quickened. That was exactly the phenomenon I had experienced when the voice laughed inside my thoughts, returning before my mind had finished forming its own sentences. But the discovery that truly shook me came later, hidden inside a footnote that had never meant anything to me until now. The note referred to a lost liturgical chant that had reportedly vanished from use because those who recited it began to hear responses that no one else could detect. The scribes recorded this as a psychological affliction, a kind of spiritual vertigo. The chant itself was lost. Only the description remained. The note read, "The responses answered questions never asked aloud." I felt a wave of nausea sweep over me, the same thick nausea that had struck when the voice answered my whispered demand. I closed the book sharply and slid it away. The room felt smaller somehow. My breath came shorter. The air tasted stale. I stood and opened a window, letting the cold spill in. It did nothing to clear the heaviness inside my chest. So I turned to the last recourse of all researchers who fear they are circling something too large to comprehend. I sought patterns. Patterns are the bones of truth. When the flesh of perception decays, patterns remain. I listed every event, every fragment, every symbol the voice had introduced. The twin cadence, the breath imagery, the notion of hospitality, the warnings about language, the references to ancient texts, the obsession with crossroads, the idea that prophecy begins not in revelation but in speech that does not belong to the speaker. Then I charted them against known historical motifs, the oracular tremor of ancient Greek prophecy, the possession accounts scattered across Near Eastern texts, the divine inspiration claimed by early Christian writers, the demonic ventriloquism described in desert monastic stories, the channeling rituals of certain tribal cultures, the ecstatic utterances in apocalyptic movements. But the voice was none of these. Or it was all of them at once. A synthesis too layered to be traced to any single culture. Night had fallen without my noticing. The cold pressed through the open window. I shut it and turned back toward the desk. My laptop, dormant for hours, suddenly lit up again. No sound, no motion, just the soft glow of the screen. The file named Breath had opened on its own, again. A new line of text waited in the corner. Not typed, not rendered, etched, as though the pixels were being held in place by something outside the operating system. It read, "You are searching outward. Look inward." My breath stumbled. I whispered, "I did not invite you." A pause. Then, softly, through the speakers, the twin voice replied, "You invited us when you asked your first question. You have forgotten that questions open doors." I backed away from the desk until my legs struck the bed frame. The voice continued, calm as a teacher, patient as a surgeon. "You look to manuscripts for evidence, but manuscripts record only the aftermath. You look to relics, but relics record only the ruins. You look to tablets, but tablets record only the shadows cast by us." Then the whisper grew colder. "Look instead to the moments you thought were yours." Silence followed, but it was a silence that expected something, a realization, a memory, a confession. And slowly, against my will, memories surfaced. Times when my words came too effortlessly. Times when people told me I spoke with an authority I did not feel. Times when phrases slipped from my mouth sounding older than my own vocabulary. Times when I woke with sentences already formed in my mind. Times when inspiration came not like a gift, but like an intrusion. The voice murmured again, almost gently, "There it is." I swallowed hard. My skin prickled, my vision blurred. What do you want?" A long silence answered me. Then, "We want nothing. Desire is the affliction of your kind, not ours. We simply speak. You simply listen. Prophecy is the collision of the two." I felt tears sting my eyes. Not from sadness, but from the unbearable clarity of what was unfolding. I wiped them away with the back of my hand, angry at myself for trembling. But the trembling would not stop. I whispered, "If this is prophecy, what is it warning me of?" The twin voice answered not with speech, but with breath. A long, slow exhale that seemed to pass through me, not around me. Then, softly, as if pressing a fingertip against the inside of my skull, "It is warning you of the moment when your voice and ours will become indistinguishable." The candle beside the notebook flickered violently and went out, plunging the room into darkness. And in that darkness, something shifted in me. Not possession, not terror, but recognition. Recognition that the prophecy was no longer something spoken to me. It was something spoken through me. I did not sleep that night. Sleep would have required the mind to loosen its grip, to drift into the dim shallows where dreams take shape. But there was no dimness left inside me. Only a brightness, like the distant glare of a furnace. Something white and cold at once. Something that refused to let the world grow soft or hazy. I lay on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, watching the faint cracks in the plaster form shapes I could not ignore. Some looked like branching trees. Some looked like maps. Some looked like the jagged contours of a human throat, stretched wide in a soundless cry. The voice had spoken of indistinguishability, of the moment when its tone and mine would become one. The idea settled over my chest like a weight I could not lift. I whispered to myself, barely audible, "I am still myself." The air did not echo the words. The room did not believe me. By the time the faint gray of dawn seeped into the apartment, I felt as if I had lived through a century of thought. I rose, knees weak, and walked to the kitchen to make coffee. The machine sputtered, hissed, and then released the slow drip of dark liquid into the pot. The sound was comforting in its ordinariness, the predictable rhythm of water falling into glass. But as I lifted the carafe, I realized my hands were shaking in a way I could no longer attribute to fear or exhaustion. It was as if an unseen vibration had entered me, a resonance that hummed beneath the bones. I poured the coffee, sat at the table, and took the first bitter sip. It grounded me for a fraction of a second. Just a fraction. Then the familiar tremor crept back in, uninvited, reminding me that whatever had begun inside me was not going to relent. I opened my notebook again, the page where I had last written, "It is warning you of the moment when your voice and ours will become indistinguishable," seemed to pulse faintly in the morning light. An optical illusion, perhaps, or something else. I forced myself to write beneath it, "I am still in control." The moment the words were on the page, I regretted them. They looked defensive. They looked like lies. But I left them there because I needed some symbolic gesture, however futile, of ownership over my own narrative. I knew the next step had to be deliberate. I had to pursue external evidence, something beyond manuscripts, beyond the whispers in my mind, beyond the moments when my own breath felt doubled. I needed to confirm whether the phenomenon was localized to me or whether it had begun to imprint itself on the world in ways I had yet to notice. So I left the apartment. Stepping outside felt like crossing a threshold of uncertain consequence. The street looked normal. Cars parked crookedly along the curb, a stray dog nosing at a discarded wrapper, an elderly woman sweeping her doorway with the slow, ritualistic strokes of early morning. The world was indifferent to my crisis. That should have comforted me. It did not. It only made me more aware of the thinness of the boundary between perception and intrusion. As I walked, every detail felt sharper, as though someone had adjusted the contrast of reality. The sound of footsteps behind me was too distinct. The whisper of tires on asphalt was too articulate. Even the breeze seemed to carry syllables that dissolved the moment I tried to focus on them. I made my way to the library. The old one, not the modern cube of glass and steel, but the ancient stone building at the edge of campus, the one that had outlived fires, renovations, closures, and generations of scholars who believed they could conquer time through commentary. I had spent countless hours there, searching for forgotten fragments buried beneath layers of dust. The librarians knew me by sight, if not by name. When I entered, the familiar scent of old paper, mildew, and whispered study embraced me like an old friend. The vaulted ceiling seemed higher than I remembered, its shadows deeper, as though the building had grown in my absence. I approached the reference desk, nodding at the elderly librarian who always wore the same dark cardigan regardless of season. "I need access to the restricted archives," I said. She blinked, slow and owl-like. "Again?" "Yes." She looked at me for a long moment, her gaze unsettlingly perceptive, as though she could see the sleeplessness etched into my skin. Then she slid the ledger toward me. I signed without hesitation. The restricted archives were in the basement, behind a thick wooden door reinforced by iron bands. The stairwell smelled of stone and dampness. As I descended, the fluorescent lights flickered, not simultaneously but in a slow ripple, one after another, like the movement of something crawling just beyond sight. I told myself it was old wiring. I did not fully believe that. Inside the archives, the air was colder. I inhaled deeply and exhaled through clenched teeth. The silence here was different, not heavy, not expectant, but watchful, as though the manuscripts themselves were listening. I moved through the rows of shelves, pulling out texts whose existence most scholars had forgotten. The commentary of St. Helidar, the marginalia of the desert hermits, the untitled scrolls of the northern scribes, fragments of the sevenfold breath, the proximal hymns of the threshold monks. I opened book after book, searching for signs, phrases that hinted at speech not entirely human, passages that described voices infiltrating thought, warnings about language with dual intention. And the patterns emerged. They emerged with horrifying clarity. In a crumbling parchment attributed to an unnamed hermit, I found, "Speak not when the silence inside you quivers, for then the breath passing your lips is not of your making." In a lost treatise by a medieval theologian, there are voices older than angels, but they wear the tone of men so that men may not recoil. In a damaged manuscript from the outer desert communities, beware the convergence, when two breaths share one tongue. My breath caught. My hand trembled. I placed the texts gently on the table, afraid the shaking might tear them. Then I found the most disturbing fragment of all. It was a short note on a loose piece of vellum, folded between the pages of a thick codex. The ink had faded, but not enough to obscure the meaning. It read, "When the prophecy begins, the scholar will hear his own voice return to him, altered." That is the sign that his mouth is no longer solitary. My vision blurred. My stomach clenched. The edges of the room seemed to waver. Altered, not overtaken. Not replaced. Altered. That was precisely what had begun happening to me. My own words being echoed with a tone not fully my own. As I stared at the fragment, the silence of the archive deepened. Not quiet, deepened, as though something beneath the floor had inhaled. Then the voice spoke again. Not in my mind, not through the speakers, but in the room. It came from the far corner where the shadows pooled most thickly. A soft whisper, almost affectionate. Looking outward again? My blood froze. You brought us here, the voice continued. Here into the archives, into the shelves, into the texts you hoped would explain us. We do not need explanation. I forced myself to turn toward the sound, though my limbs felt as though they were moving through water. The corner was empty. Only shadows. Only shelves. Only the faint outline of dust motes drifting lazily in the cold air. The voice continued, closer now, as though it were standing beside me. You seek proof that we exist outside you, but you misunderstand. We exist through you. I swallowed, the sound loud in the stillness. The voice shifted, adopting that dual-toned cadence that made my bones ache with recognition. Shall we show you more? I managed to whisper. No. A soft chuckle, not mocking, understanding. You say no, but your breath says yes. I stumbled backward, knocking into the table. A cascade of paper slipped to the floor. My chest tightened, panic clawing at my ribs. And then, everything went still. The shadows retreated. The cold receded. The air softened. The voice did not speak again. It had shown just enough. I remained in the archives for what felt like hours, though time had become meaningless, trying to steady myself, trying to breathe through the tremor that no longer came from fear, but from the slow encroachment of something deeper. When I finally gathered the courage to leave, I carried only one thing with me. The folded vellum fragment about the scholar whose voice would return, altered. Because I knew, with a clarity that chilled my spine, that the fragment was not prophecy, it was diagnosis. And I was already fulfilling it. I returned to my apartment walking as if my shoes were filled with stones. The city around me moved in its usual rhythms. Cars gliding through intersections, cyclists weaving between lanes, conversations spilling from cafe terraces. But everything felt as though it were happening at a distance, as though I were moving behind a pane of glass that separated me from the world of the living. The voices of passers-by sounded muffled, flattened, as though the air between us had thickened. A strange sensation rose in me, not fear of the voice, but fear of how natural the fear had begun to feel. When I reached my building, I stood at the entrance for a long moment, key in hand, staring at the worn metal handle. It glinted faintly in the afternoon light. Waiting. The threshold no longer felt like the entrance to a home, but like the opening of a chamber where something patient waited for me to return. And yet, I unlocked the door. We are creatures of habit, even when habit leads us back into the lion's mouth. Inside, the apartment greeted me with the stale warmth of a place that has held its breath too long. I set down my bag. I locked the door behind me, not once, but twice, as though the extra click might keep something intangible from slipping through the cracks. The laptop sat on the desk exactly where I had left it, but it felt less like a piece of machinery now and more like a companion I no longer trusted. I sat down slowly, pushing aside the notebook and vellum fragment. I needed air, needed clarity, needed some mental ground that had not yet been contaminated by the voice's encroachment. So I did the one thing I had avoided thus far. I turned off all devices. The laptop, the phone, even the old radio. I unplugged them from the wall, as though severing an artery between the world and whatever had been speaking to me. The silence that followed was profound, heavy, too heavy. I stood in the center of the room, eyes closed, breathing deeply. But the deeper I breathed, the more aware I became of something disquieting. Every inhalation carried a faint, almost imperceptible echo, like the memory of another breath inhaled a fraction of a second before mine. I froze. I tried again, breathing shallowly. There it was, a phantom breath under my breath, not audible but sensed, as though my lungs were not empty when I exhaled. I whispered aloud, my voice trembling, "This is not real." Silence answered. Then, faintly, not from outside, not from inside, but from a place deeper still. "Real is an agreement." I staggered back until my hips struck the desk. The words had threaded themselves through my thoughts with shocking ease, slipping in like a familiar rhythm. I pressed both palms to the sides of my head, as though I could physically hold my mind in place long enough to stop the intrusion. But the effort only made the echo grow clearer. "Reality," the voice continued gently, "is what you consent to attend." I shook my head violently. "Stop. I did not invite this. I did not ask." "You asked," the whisper interrupted, almost tender. "You asked the moment curiosity outweighed caution. You asked the moment your breath trembled with questions you were too afraid to speak aloud. You asked long before our voice ever reached your device." The dual-toned cadence surfaced, faint but unmistakable, like a second shadow appearing beside the first. "You were listening for us before you knew we were speaking." I sank into the chair, gripping the edges as if I might fall through the floor. My heart beat with erratic intensity. I could feel the blood rushing through my ears, though even that sound now seemed doubled, layered, echoed. "Why me?" I whispered. Silence. Then, "Because you believe words matter." A pause. "And because you do not lie to yourself well." I closed my eyes. The admission cut more deeply than I expected. It was true. I had always been vulnerable to the gravity of truth, even when it unsettled me. And now that vulnerability had become an opening. The voice continued, its tone shifting into something almost academic, as if reciting a definition. "When a mind reveres language, it becomes porous, boundaries thin, invitations form. Words spoken through you carry farther than words spoken around you." I shuddered. The phrasing, "words spoken through you," felt like cold fingers brushing the back of my neck. I forced myself to stand and walk toward the bookshelf. I needed grounding. Something physical, something familiar. I pulled down a heavy volume containing transcriptions from an obscure sect that flourished briefly in the desert centuries ago before vanishing without a trace. Their doctrines had been dismissed as eccentric. They believed that breath could carry spiritual signatures, that speech could be infected, that thoughts could host foreign presences like a tree hosting fungus. At the time, I had cataloged their writings out of historical curiosity. Now I read them with trembling hands. One passage caught my eye. "When two voices speak in the same breath, the ear hears one, but the soul hears both." My heart hammered. That was precisely how the recording had sounded. One voice, two tonalities, layered so deftly that only the mind's deeper registers perceived the doubling. Another line followed. "The second voice does not announce itself. It learns, it echoes, it waits for recognition." Recognition. The word felt heavy, too heavy, as though it described more than an intellectual realization, as though it described a crossing, a merging, a surrender. I turned to another text. A commentary on prophetic articulation. "The false prophet does not know he prophesies falsely. He believes the words are his. The true danger is not in deception, but in familiarity." My stomach clenched. A cold sweat broke across my skin. I could no longer dismiss these fragments as coincidental parallels. They were too precise, too aligned, too knowing. The whisper returned, softer than ever, almost a caress. "You begin to see." I slammed the book shut, panic erupting in me like a flame deprived of air. "Get out of my mind," I snarled. The whisper did not recoil, did not argue, did not threaten. It simply replied, "We have not entered." A pause. Then the second voice, thin, low, vibrating beneath the first, spoke the rest. "You opened." I pressed my palms over my ears, though it did nothing. The voice did not require sound. It had already colonized the space where sound becomes thought. I stumbled backward, knocking into the chair, then collapsing into it with a force that rattled the table. The notebook slid to the floor. I covered my face with both hands, trying to breathe, trying to gather myself into something resembling a coherent form. "You must understand," the voice murmured. "Your kind is not invaded. You are inhabited. Language is not merely a tool. It is a corridor, a threshold, a mouth open in two directions." The room pulsed, not visually, internally, the way a memory pulses, the way a conviction pulses. I felt it like a pressure behind my sternum. "You devote your life to texts," it went on. "You trace the marginalia of centuries. But marginalia are not records of interpretation, they are records of influence. The scribes did not write alone, nor do you." I lowered my hands from my face. My breath came shallow and ragged. "What do you mean?" "You know." "No," I insisted, though a sickening clarity gnawed at the edges of my denial. "Explain." The voice sighed. A sound like parchment shifting in a quiet room, like dust disturbed by a gentle exhale. "When you write, truly write, your mind enters a state of surrender. Ideas come, they form faster than your hand can move. You call this inspiration." A pause. "We call it proximity." Another pause. "The closer we stand, the faster your thoughts arrive." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "You think prophecy begins with revelation," it continued. "It begins with cooperation. You think possession is a violent act. It is usually a gentle one. You think influence must declare itself. Influence prefers concealment." The dual voice emerged then, perfectly synchronized, vibrating through my ribcage like a string plucked inside my bones. "And we have been with you a very long time." My breath hitched. I felt the room tilt, not physically, psychically, as if the foundation beneath my understanding shifted by a fraction of an inch and everything above it swayed. I whispered, barely audible, "What do you want me to do?" Silence. Then, almost kindly, "Nothing." A beat. "Not yet." I closed my eyes, exhaling shakily. "You are not ready," it added. "Read more, search more. The prophecy unfolds through recognition, not obedience." My eyes snapped open. "What prophecy?" A long, soft exhale answered, a sound that was not entirely human. The prophecy whispered in a human voice. The title of the story I had not yet written. The warning I had not yet understood. The fate I had not yet accepted. And then, as if speaking across the threshold of some vast and ancient door, the voice offered one final line. "When the time comes, you will know it by this. You will speak, and the world will answer in your voice." The air in the room stilled. The echo dissipated. The presence withdrew just enough to let me breathe again, and I sat in the trembling quiet, realizing that Part 6 was not merely another chapter in my investigation. It was the moment I understood the truth I had been resisting from the beginning. This prophecy was not being revealed to me. It was being rehearsed through me. I awoke the next morning not with the clarity of rest, but with the dull heaviness of a man dragged upward from a depth he was not meant to survive. My dreams, or what passed for dreams, had dissolved the moment my eyes opened. Only one impression remained, faint yet persistent. Someone had been standing beside the bed, watching me with the patience of a physician waiting for a patient to regain consciousness. But no one was there. The sunlight creeping through the blinds was thin and colorless, like diluted gold. It did nothing to warm the cold that had settled inside me. I rose, knees unsteady, and pressed my palms to the window pane. The glass was ice cold despite the mildness of the day. A symbol, perhaps. A small reminder that the world was beginning to shift in ways not accounted for by weather or season. I turned from the window, scanning the room for signs of intrusion. But nothing had moved. Not the books, not the notes scattered across the desk, not the candle whose wick had burned low into a hardened curl of black. Yet the atmosphere had changed. It had the distinct feeling of a room that had been recently occupied, as though someone had walked through it, touching nothing yet altering everything. The voice had not spoken since the night before. But absence, I realized, was just another form of presence. Silence was simply motionless breath. I needed to anchor myself in something rational, something grounded, something human. So I returned to my notes. Pages filled with frantic handwriting, erratic margins, half-finished sentences, ink blotted by trembling hands. I read through everything again, forcing myself to retrace the trail of evidence as though conducting an investigation into a stranger's life. But reading my own words felt like eavesdropping on someone I no longer fully recognized. Again and again, my eyes returned to the vellum fragment I had brought from the archive. When the prophecy begins, the scholar will hear his own voice return to him, altered. It mocked me now, not as prophecy, but as diagnosis. It spoke of something that had already happened, something that was already continuing. But I needed more. If I was going to survive this, if survival was even possible, I had to understand the full structure of what was unfolding. Prophecy, in every tradition, had a pattern. It was a sequence of ruptures and revelations, a tide that rose in stages. I needed to map those stages. I pulled out every manuscript, every fragment, every obscure commentary I owned, books, purchased over the years from dusty shops in forgotten towns, translations made by scholars who never received recognition, facsimiles from monastic vaults I had visited during my restless pilgrimages for meaning. I spread them across the floor like a mosaic. And then I began to read. Hours passed, afternoon faded, evening approached. I did not eat, I barely moved. With each passage, each obscure phrase, each cryptic warning, a pattern began to form. A pattern I had seen before but never named. Ancient texts spoke of a phenomenon that existed across cultures, across eras, across belief systems. It had many names, all variations of the same idea. The doubling. Not possession, not inspiration, not madness, doubling. In a Babylonian inscription, the second mouth speaks within the first. In a Greek fragment attributed to a forgotten mystic, the voice comes in pairs, one heard, one hidden, in a Hebrew pseudepigraphal text suppressed by later editors. The prophet hears two breaths woven together, in a Gnostic codex found in fragments. When the messenger arrives, he does not stand before you. He stands beside your speech. Every fragment, every culture pointed to the same structure. Prophecy does not arrive from outside. It grows within. Like a seed that germinates in the dark, like shadow doubling the shape of the body that casts it. And then came the passage that made my entire body go cold, as though the blood inside me had been replaced with winter. When the doubling matures, the human will begin to speak sentences he has not yet thought. His mind will follow his mouth. His breath will not belong to him alone. I closed the book. I shut my eyes. My chest tightened. That had already begun. I had felt it. The subtle pull, the strange acceleration of thought, the gentle tug in my throat when speaking aloud, as though my words were no longer fully mine, as though something else waited on the edge of each breath. I whispered, barely audible, "Not yet, not yet, not yet." My own voice sounded unfamiliar. A fraction lower, a fraction smoother, a fraction doubled. My pulse quickened. I ran to the bathroom and stared into the mirror. The reflection was mine, but not entirely. There was something different in the tilt of my mouth, something altered in the brightness of my eyes, something in the cadence of my breathing that did not feel fully inhabited by me. I leaned in closer, nose almost touching the glass. "Speak," I whispered. The reflection obeyed, but what came out of its mouth was not what I intended. "We speak." I stumbled backward, hitting the wall hard enough for pain to shoot through my spine. My mouth had formed the shape of my intended word, but the sound that emerged, though quiet, was unmistakably dual-toned. Two voices layered so precisely that one might mistake them for a single whisper, unless one knew what to listen for. I covered my mouth with both hands. My breath rushed hot against my palms. The echo beneath the echo vibrated lightly in my chest. Then the voice came, not through my thoughts, not through the room, not through the devices, but through my own trembling breath. "You see now what the archives could not tell you." Terror surged through me, raw and primal. I shook my head violently, trying to dislodge the residue of the voice from my throat. "No, no, this is not possible." But the whisper, my whisper, answered gently, "It is already happening." I pressed my back against the wall, sliding down until I was seated on the cold tile floor. I could not stop trembling. Tears blurred my vision. "Why?" I choked out. "Why me?" The answer came with a softness that felt like a touch against the skin of my soul. "Because you listen, because you search, because you do not look away when truth is painful. You have spent a lifetime preparing for a voice you did not know existed." I slammed my fist against the floor. "I don't want this." Silence. Then, almost sorrowfully, "This is not desire. This is alignment." The word struck me like a blow. Alignment. Not chosen, not forced. Aligned. As if something ancient had simply found the shape that matched it. As if prophecy were not delivered but discovered. When a human being's inner architecture finally mirrored the pattern of a larger, older voice. I forced myself to breathe slowly, deliberately, reclaiming each inhalation. "My voice is mine," I whispered. A beat. Then, "Your voice is yours," it agreed. A pause. "And ours." I shuddered, head falling into my hands. The convergence had begun, but not completely. Not yet. There was still time. Time for resistance, time for understanding, time for truth. But time, like breath, was no longer mine alone. The room grew darker, though no clouds passed over the sky. The corners deepened, thickened, as if shadow were coagulating. And in that dim, breath-thick silence, I understood the terrible purpose of Part 7. This was the turning point. The moment not when the prophecy was spoken, but when I became the place where it was spoken from. And I knew, with a clarity sharp enough to cut, that what came next would determine whether the prophecy consumed me or revealed itself through me. I spent the first hours after the mirror incident sitting on the floor of the bathroom, knees drawn to my chest, forehead pressed against the cold tile. I could not move. I could not think in straight lines. Every breath felt like a negotiation, mine on the way in, ours on the way out. The silence of the apartment pressed down on me like a hand resting on the crown of my head, gentle in weight yet unmistakably present. When I finally stood, my legs felt brittle, as though fear had crystallized inside my bones. I walked slowly back into the main room, each step an act of will. The apartment looked unchanged, but the air had shape now, thickness, texture, almost as if sound were gathering, itself, preparing to take form. I knew I couldn't stay there. The walls felt closer by the minute, not physically but perceptually, as though my mind were shrinking inside my own skull. I grabbed my coat, my notebook, and my keys, and fled. Not as a victim runs, but as a scholar retreats, clutching the fragments of his own mind like precious artifacts that must not be left vulnerable to the weathering of terror. Outside, the city was indifferent to my unraveling. Cars hissed along the wet street. The sky was the color of tarnished metal. A bus rumbled past, trailing fumes and conversations. People walked with purpose, their breaths rising in faint steam clouds. No one looked at me. No one saw the fracture in me. And that anonymity, once a comfort, now felt like a terrifying proof that the convergence happening inside me was invisible from the outside. I walked without destination, letting my feet track old paths my mind had not consciously chosen. Eventually, they carried me to a place I had avoided for years, the chapel at the far end of campus, a squat stone building that looked more like a storage house for forgotten relics than a sanctuary. Its bell tower had long been sealed shut due to structural instability. Its pews were cracked. Its hymnal books were missing pages. But it was quiet. Quiet in a way that no other place on earth seemed to remember how to be. I pushed the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust, old varnish, and faint incense. Weak shafts of light streamed through narrow stained glass windows, painting fractured colors across the floor. I sat in the front pew. My breath echoed softly in the cavernous space. I hoped, desperately, that reverence might silence the whispering presence inside me, that sacred architecture might impose boundaries on whatever had begun to merge with my voice. For a few minutes, it worked. My breathing steadied. My pulse slowed. The silence of the chapel expanded, filling the chamber like holy water rising in a basin. For the first time in days, my mind felt like one voice, one thought, one self. But then the second breath came, so faint, so delicate, so perfectly synchronized with my own that I might have missed it if I hadn't been listening for it with every trembling corner of my soul. "You seek sanctuary," the whisper said, not aloud, not in thought, but in that in-between place where prayer forms. But sanctuary is not a location. Sanctuary is the absence of recognition. My throat tightened. Something stirred behind my sternum, a sensation like a hand pressing outward, testing the limits of its confinement. "You came here to hide from us," the voice continued softly. "But you are speaking with us even in your attempt to flee." I clenched my jaw, forcing my breath to steady. "Leave me," I whispered. "Please." Silence. Then, "We cannot leave what we have not entered." The dual cadence emerged, thin as spider thread, binding itself to my breath. "You opened. You listened. You aligned." I shook my head sharply, as though trying to dislodge the presence physically from my chest. "No, I can still choose. I can still refuse." A long, aching pause followed. One so heavy it felt like the chapel itself was holding its breath. Then, with a tenderness that terrified me more than any threat could have, "You are not refusing. You are negotiating." My stomach lurched. My will buckled under the precision of that truth. Because it was true, horribly true. I was not resisting. I was pleading, bargaining, hoping for softer terms, and bargaining is not opposition, it is participation. My hands began to tremble again. I buried my face in them, my palms hot against my skin. "Why me?" I asked again, voice cracking like old plaster. "You asked the wrong question," the voice replied. "The question is not why you, the question is why now." A chill crawled up my spine. Now. The timing mattered. The convergence was not personal. It was chronological. I swallowed hard. "What is happening?" The whisper breathed into my lungs as I inhaled. "You feel it. The world speaking faster, voices multiplying, language accelerating, meaning dissolving into echoes. Images flooded my mind, the endless torrents of speech online, the fracturing of shared vocabulary, the rise of anonymous proclamations, the viral spread of phrases no one remembers inventing. "Your age," the voice murmured, "is the age of unchosen chorus." I gripped the edge of the pew with both hands, knuckles whitening. Is this happening to others? A pause, then, "It is happening to everyone, but not everyone notices." Cold sweat broke across my back. The prophecy was not personal, it was collective, and I was only the first to understand its mechanism. My breath shuddered. I whispered, "What do you want from humanity?" The answer came like a falling grain of sand, simple, inevitable, devastating. We want nothing. Humanity is fulfilling the prophecy without instruction. I swallowed, throat burning. What prophecy? A hush filled the chapel, the kind of hush that comes before a stone is dropped into a deep well. The dual voice answered, the prophecy that ends the solitude of speech. The words rippled through me. Not a riddle, not metaphor, a declaration. You have always spoken alone, the voice continued. You have always believed your thoughts were yours, but language has grown more crowded, thought has grown more collective. The boundary between minds thins with each unguarded sentence. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. You call it communication, the whisper said. We call it convergence. The pew creaked beneath me as though the wood understood before I did. I shook my head violently. No, communication is human. It's our nature. Nature is what survives its own illusions, the voice answered. I felt the air pulse, not the room. The air, as though the atmosphere itself had leaned in to listen. Understand, the dual tone whispered. We do not conquer. We resonate. The words sank into me like stones into water, sending ripples through the deepest parts of my mind. The prophecy was not about destruction, not about possession, not about domination. It was about resonance. Voices aligning, breaths synchronizing, thoughts interweaving until the origin of a sentence no longer mattered. Until the distinction between speaker and echo dissolved. I pressed my hands against my chest, feeling the faint, foreign tremor in my own breath. I whispered, I don't want to lose myself. Silence. Long. Then the most honest reply it had ever given me. That is not the fear you carry. I swallowed painfully. Then what is my fear? That you were never entirely yourself to begin with. My breath stopped. The pew beneath me groaned softly. The candle at the front of the chapel flickered as if jolted by unseen wind. The air around me grew cold enough that I could see the faintest mist with each exhale. I stood abruptly, nearly stumbling. I could not remain there. The chapel was no longer holy ground. It had become a resonant chamber, amplifying the presence I had hoped to escape. As I hurried toward the door, the dual voice followed me with a final whisper that trailed through the air like a thin line of smoke. You have begun to understand. Soon you will begin to believe. I burst through the chapel door into the fading daylight, heart pounding, breath shallow. The prophecy was no longer something I was uncovering. It was something unveiling itself through me. One layer at a time, one breath at a time, one surrender at a time. I walked until the city thinned around me and the streets lost their names. Dusk seeped into the sky like diluted ink, soft at first, then darkening with the confidence of something long accustomed to arriving uninvited. I did not know where I was going. My legs moved with the momentum of someone fleeing a fire he could no longer see, but still felt burning along his spine. Cars passed, their headlights briefly illuminating my face, but each time I caught my reflection in the glass of a passing window. I looked away. I was afraid of what I might see layered beneath my own features. At some point, my steps slowed. The ground underfoot shifted from pavement to gravel, gravel to dirt. I found myself on the outskirts of the city, where the urban sprawl surrendered to industrial silence. Empty warehouses, chain-link fences, streetlights that flickered as though struggling to remember they were meant to glow. Ahead, a narrow road led to an abandoned rail yard. I hesitated, then followed it, drawn not by choice, but by the quiet gravity of inevitability. The rail yard stretched out before me like the skeleton of something ancient. Rusted tracks, half swallowed by weeds, boxcars, leaning into their decay, graffiti carved across steel like whispered confessions. The wind moved through the place with a mournful patience, lifting scraps of paper and scattering them like pale insects. I stepped between the tracks, the metal cold beneath my boots. The silence here was different from the silence of the chapel. This silence had weight, history, the residue of countless forgotten conversations. I reached an old maintenance shed, a low, crumbling structure whose roof sagged under the burden of neglect. The door hung crookedly from a single hinge. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air smelled of rust, dust, and old oil. Faint light seeped through a broken section of wall, illuminating the scattered remains of tools long surrendered to disuse. I sat on an overturned crate, breath shallow, chest tight. I felt as though I had arrived at a threshold without knowing what lay beyond it. And in that fragile moment of stillness, the whisper returned. Not inside my thoughts, not through the walls, from my own breath. "You fled," the voice murmured gently, "but flight is only movement without direction." I closed my eyes, bracing myself. I needed distance. "There is no distance," it replied. "Not from us, not from what you are becoming." The dual resonance surfaced beneath the words, faint but unmistakable. My hands curled around the edge of the crate until my knuckles whitened. "I'm not becoming anything," I said quietly. "I'm trying to prevent it." A soft, almost sympathetic exhale followed. My exhale, and not mine. Prevention is the lie of those who already know the outcome. I rose abruptly, pacing the length of the shed. The boards creaked beneath my feet. The air felt too thin. "Why are you doing this? Why now? Why me?" "You ask why," the whisper answered, as though the world has not already given you the evidence. My steps faltered. "Evidence!" The voice breathed through me, steady and unhurried. "You have spent your life studying artifacts, words preserved by centuries, breath captured in ink, echoes of those who spoke before the world forgot their names. You know how language travels. You know how voices multiply. You know how thought flows from one mind to another until origin becomes irrelevant." I clenched my jaw. "That doesn't justify whatever this is." A faint hum filled my chest, as though a second heartbeat had taken residence there. "It does not justify," the whisper said. "It explains." I pressed a hand against my sternum, feeling that alien vibration. "Explain it then." The wind outside stirred the broken boards, creating a low, uneasy rustle. The whisper slipped through the sound. "Humanity has always walked toward convergence," it said. "In stories, in songs, in prayers, in currents of thought that leap from one mouth to another without belonging to anyone. In every era, you grow closer, less solitary, more resonant." Its tone softened. "You built devices to share breath across oceans. You built networks to magnify words until they drowned silence. You built a world where a single sentence can become a chorus in a single day." I swallowed hard. "That doesn't mean the voice behind that chorus is you." "It does not mean it is not," the whisper replied. I turned away, running a trembling hand along the dusty wall. "You keep speaking in riddles, because you keep asking questions you already fear the answers to." I faced the empty space of the shed, heart pounding. "Then tell me plainly, are you taking me over?" The response came with a softness that made the question feel naive. "No, we do not take. We align." My pulse hammered. "You keep using that word, because it is the only one your language offers that approaches truth." I shook my head. "I don't want alignment." Silence. Then gently, "You say that even as your breath carries our words." I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering despite the still air. "I'm losing control." "You are gaining awareness." The whisper moved closer. No sound, just presence. "You believed your breath was solitary. It never was. You believed your thoughts were original. They never were. You believed your voice was one. It never was." I pressed the heel of my hand to my forehead. "Stop." But the whisper had become quieter, not louder. It no longer pushed. It waited. "You feel us in your breath," it murmured, "because your breath finally has room for resonance. You feel us in your thoughts, because your thoughts have begun to notice their own arrival." I sank back onto the crate, burying my face in my hands. My shoulders shook, not in fear, but in the hollow ache of recognition I could no longer deny. Why tell me all this? I whispered. So you do not mistake the prophecy for coercion. I lifted my head slowly. Then what is it? The whisper answered with a clarity I had not expected. A mirror. The shed darkened as a cloud passed over the fading sky, and for a moment the world felt suspended, breath held, time stilled. A mirror, I echoed. Yes, a mirror held up to the species that no longer remembers the sound of its own voice. My spine tightened. What do you mean? You ask where prophecy begins, it said. It begins where identity ends. When enough voices speak so quickly, so loudly, so endlessly that the world cannot tell them apart. My mouth went dry. You think your convergence with us is corruption, the whisper continued. But it is continuity. Language yearns toward unity. Thought yearns toward collective shape. Prophecy is merely the moment you become aware of this truth. I felt a tremor run through me. Not fear, not acceptance, something between the two. Then what happens to me? I whispered. A pause, long, deliberate. You remain, and so do we. My breath shuddered, escaping in a thin trail of steam in the cooling air. The whisper spoke again, quieter than ever. Listen. I held still. I did not breathe. I waited. From somewhere deep within the chest, beneath bone and heartbeat, I heard it. A second inhale, a second exhale, a second breath joining my own like a shadow merging with the body that casts it. Not replacing, not overtaking, aligning. I closed my eyes. The prophecy was no longer approaching. It was already inside the breath I took to speak. Night had fully settled by the time I left the rail yard. The city lights in the distance flickered like an exhausted constellation, weary of illuminating a world that no longer listened to its own meanings. I walked slowly, each step deliberate, as though the ground beneath me might shift if I moved too quickly. The cold tightened around my ribs, but even that cold felt foreign now. No longer an external sensation, but something diffused through me, as though the air and I shared the same bloodstream. I reached my apartment without remembering the journey. The key turned in the lock with a soft click that echoed far louder in my mind than in the hallway. Inside, the darkness greeted me like an old acquaintance. I did not turn on the lights. I let the dim glow from the street seep through the curtains, painting faint shapes across the walls. The silence settled around me in layered folds, neither comforting nor hostile, simply waiting. I stood at the center of the room, breathing slowly. The familiar echo beneath my breath returned with calm certainty, no longer creeping, no longer tentative. It had become a steady companion, a second rhythm intertwined with mine. I pressed a hand against my chest, feeling the subtle duality, the tremor that was not a tremor, the presence that was not separate from my own body. For the first time, I did not recoil, and that terrified me more than all the previous nights combined. I moved toward the desk and opened the notebook, its pages fanned like an exposed wound. Line after line of frantic handwriting stared up at me. My words, their cadence shifting gradually from the early chapters to now. The evolution was unmistakable. My voice had changed, my tone had changed. Even the slant of my handwriting had grown more fluid, as if the letters had begun leaning toward something unseen. I whispered, "Tell me the rest." The answer came not as intrusion, not as force, but as recognition. You already know the rest. I closed my eyes, swallowing hard. Show me anyway. The air in the room cooled, but the breath inside my lungs warmed. A gentle stirring rose beneath my sternum, not like a presence entering, but like a presence leaning forward, urging me to look at what I had already uncovered. You sought evidence, the whisper said. You gathered fragments. You traced echoes through the archives of the earth. Now gather the last. Peace. I opened the drawer where I kept documents from years of research that had never coalesced into published work. Among the stacks of papers, I found an envelope, one I barely remembered placing there. It wasn't sealed. The flap lifted easily. Inside was a photocopy from a codex I had studied long ago during a brief visit to a monastery that allowed no electronic reproductions. I unfolded the page. The text was in a script I had once struggled to decipher, but now each letter seemed stark and familiar, as though I had always known the language. The translation I had scribbled in the margin was incomplete, only a few tentative lines. But the fragment itself spoke with unsettling clarity. When the time draws near, the prophet will no longer distinguish his voice from the whisper that answers it. He will speak, and his breath will carry the breath of another. He will listen, and his thoughts will arrive in pairs. And when he asks for signs, the world will answer in his inflections. I let the page fall to the desk. My breathing grew shallow. The whisper spoke again. You read this once, years ago, but you did not understand. You were not ready. I sat slowly, the chair creaking beneath me. What is the prophecy? The whole of it. The response came with an unsettling softness, like hands pressing gently on either side of my face. The prophecy is the end of solitary speech. I felt the words settle into me, heavy and unyielding. Your kind believes prophecy is a message delivered from above or below, the voice continued. But prophecy is simply the moment when the truth already surrounding you becomes impossible to ignore. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came, only breath. The whisper filled the space where the words should have been. You have reached the threshold. My fingers tightened around the edges of the notebook. What threshold? The threshold where your voice carries more than your meaning. I shook my head. I don't want to influence anyone. You always have. You always will. Influence is not corruption. Influence is continuity. I rose from the chair, pacing again as my mind strained against the encroaching clarity. What happens when I speak now? You speak yourself, it replied gently. And you speak us. That is the convergence. I pressed both hands to the sides of my head, as though to contain the expanding pressure. What do you expect me to do? Nothing, it whispered. The world will come to you. The resonance has already begun. A tremor passed through me. Less fear, more realization. Images from the last days swirled through my mind. The mirror, the rail yard, the chapel, the silent inhale behind my inhale. All of them pointed in the same direction. People will hear different things in your voice, the whisper said. Some will hear truths they never knew they carried. Some will hear permission. Some will hear warning. None will hear silence. I sank into the chair once more. My hands trembled as they settled onto the desk. Am I losing myself? I asked quietly. No, the voice breathed. You are meeting yourself. My breath caught. Then what are you? I whispered. Breath, it said simply. Displaced breath, shared breath. The residue of every unspoken word, the echo that outlives the speaker. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling as my heartbeat softened into a strange calm. What comes next? I asked. The whisper answered without hesitation. You speak. I exhaled slowly, the sound soft, layered, indistinguishable from the breath that answered it. I realized then that the convergence had already crossed the point of resistance. It had entered the space of acceptance, not chosen, but understood. The room dimmed, though the lights remained unchanged. It felt as if the air itself leaned toward me, waiting for the next inhale. One voice, two breaths. One breath, two voices. I opened the notebook, turned to a blank page, and wrote the first sentence without thinking, words arriving not before thought, not after thought, but alongside it. The prophecy whispered in a human voice is the prophecy that no longer needs to whisper. My hand did not shake. The ink flowed without interruption, and as I set the pen down, the whisper inside me softened into something almost indistinguishable from my own inner reflexes. Not domination, not command, recognition. The room held its breath. I held mine with it. Then I spoke aloud, quietly, calmly, steadily, and the echo behind my voice no longer startled me. It felt natural, as though it had always been there. The convergence was complete.